I'm sorry to say that our dear colleague, I get an echo now? No. My dear colleague Atta Ansari will not be able to join us, and he has very good excuses since he's doing his final editing of a documentary. He works for the Norwegian Broadcasting, final editing of a documentary on the corona situation. So he is excused, but I would recommend you very much, all of you, to read his chapter in the book that I've recommended from the very beginning. It's a book on both this extremist views and debates around the freedom of expression, and also it sort of goes all the way from the cartoon issue as it emerged in 2005 until the Norwegian extremist killing in 2011. So that said, I will do this, and I have some reasons for doing this, and that is that I was coordinating together with a Finnish professor a research project on this issue after it happened. I found myself in Lahore, actually, the spring of 2006. I was there as a fellow at the Punjab University, and as the riots and protests unfolded there, I was sort of a very close witness, and it triggered, of course, my journalistic instincts. And then this Finnish professor writes to me, well, we are thinking of having this cartoon project. Would you do the Norwegian scene? I said, no, I'd rather do Pakistan since I find myself here. Oh, that's even better, he said. And I got one of my students to analyze from Norway. So that's how I found myself in the middle of a situation where I could read the situation in Pakistan with the help, of course, of a colleague of mine at the time, Binesh Chima. And she helped also translate the Urdu newspapers. And I could think of how people's sentiments were in Pakistan, and simultaneously I was aware of the sentiments back in Norway and the Nordic countries. So that is my background for speaking on this issue. But it's not only about the cartoon issue from then. Some of you must have been very young when this controversy happened. I realized that. Okay, here we go. In this lecture, I'm going to introduce the concept of contrapuntal readings. It's a concept I have borrowed from Edward Said, the famous writer and scholar who wrote, among other books, Orientalism. I'm going to give a short outline of the cartoon controversy, which started in August 2005 and its aftermath. And I'm going to deal with freedom, expression, proponents and interpretations, because they vary greatly, and try to say something about extremist positions and end up with a storytelling. I think in Ramadan, it's good to have some storytelling as a genre. It's a story from Fatah, something that happened to a colleague of mine when he was traveling in the federally administered tribal areas in Pakistan. As you see, the illustration here is a piece of art made by an Uruguayan artist, and he says our north is the south, and he tries to turn, as we would say, the world upside down, but who knows which way the world works in a larger universal perspective. So for me, this is an illustration of people trying to illustrate again that you might see the world from different angles, depending on where you are and your experiences. So the cartoon project consisted then of researchers from 14 countries, including people of different creeds. One of our Canadian researcher was a Muslim. We had me and my colleague from Pakistan. We had people from Bangladesh, etc., etc. And we tried to map how the media coverage of the cartoon issue actually ended in different discourses on freedom of expression, which I will show to you. We made 2 publications, and the last publication, which is the best one, was made in 2008, and it's available online, as you can see from the address below, and you don't have to press the PDF button, and you can have the whole book for free. You see here also an illustration of the Pakistani scene by the magazine The Herald. So here is a cartoon of the cartoon issue, as it were. And I think you might recognize the figure to the right, which is the then ruler of Pakistan, General Musharraf. And I guess you can maybe better than me also recognize some of the other figures. Okay? You may interrupt me with questions if you like underway, with comments also, since I'm dealing a bit with the Pakistani scene, you might have observations and experiences that are worthwhile saying while you're at it, while you see my presentation. Feel free. Okay. Contrapuntal readings. You know, I've described one cartoon to you the other day when we had this course, and here I found it back. You see, here you can have two very different angles of view. You have here an ISIS killer, convert to Islam or die, and then you have these prisoners saying you first, which is, of course, a very ironic, sarcastic cartoon. Contrapuntal readings. Edward Said, his main studies were of British and French classical literature from the 19th century, the 1800s. And what he saw when he read this literature was that they more or less took colonialism for granted. So they could talk about coming back from, you know, India or coming back from the Caribbeans as if it were part of their property, more or less, in the novels of this century. So for him, it was interesting to explore how to read this literature with the eyes of the former colonized people, from the colonized subject. So that is one of his main achievements in the world of literature theory, actually to try to read a work of literature from different perspectives. If you look at the modern applications of Said, you can say that his inspiration has been that many researchers, maybe more than before, look at the world with different lenses, that we try also to put on different lenses when we read a story, when we read a situation. And we realize perhaps also a bit more than before that the reactions that you find across the world to phenomena depend on the context you live in, on your background, and on your own cultural capital, etc. I think this is vital. I remember myself coming back from having lived in Pakistan for 1.5 years in the late 1980s and coming back to Norway in the middle of the summer and thinking, what if I were an Afghan refugee coming for the first time to Norway in the middle of the summer and seeing this half nakedness? I mean, the way people dress here, which is so different from how people dress in at least the conservative parts of Pakistan. So, I mean, that was learning for me. I remember I was walking in sort of shorts and a t-shirt, and I was trying to avoid meeting a sort of patriarch that I knew from before, an Afghan refugee, because I felt embarrassed to be undressed for this occasion. So, you know, this is kind of a learning that is not, it comes with a lot of experience, I think, having lived elsewhere. But it can also be an experience that we have from exchanging views with people from the diaspora and also, of course, from literature, films, and whatnot. And I think also another issue is, and this will lead me on to the cartoon crisis and controversies, is can we recognize each other's readings even if we don't always accept them? Can we recognize that we look at situations and media output in different ways due to our different contexts, due to our different backgrounds, and due to our different upbringing, education, everything? So I leave that as a question for you to think of while I continue. Here you see an interesting cartoon, here you see an interesting cartoon by one of the French cartoonists, Plantu, or Jean Planturet. He's from Le Monde, one of the largest newspapers. And by the way, connecting to Said, Edward Said wrote also another book called Covering Islam, where he looked at the media coverage of the Iranian Revolution. And he found that one of the few European newspapers who actually had a more sort of diversified coverage of that Iranian Revolution, that was Le Monde, which looked at that there were 4 different forces competing for power in the Iranian Revolution. It was not just a revolution of the Ayatollahs, for example. But that is a digression. What I'm about to try to say here with this cartoon is that the context matters. You see the difference between maybe he means the lower part of the globe to be a metaphor for the global south and the upper part to be a metaphor from the richest of the rich global north. But at least context matter for us all, both for cartoonists, for their publishers, and for their readers and their analysts. And I think we have also to realize now that we live in a world where borders are very porous, or very sort of slippery, very easy to pass through, at least with content such as visuals, particularly. I'll come back to that. Two theoreticians, Bonegro and Forteville, they say that we have to read things in cartoons particularly. They write an article about cartoons. They say we have to look both at the textual and the extra-textual context. With textual, they mean what kind of publication, what kind of newspaper, eventually what kind of media conglomerate. And the extra-textual context is how does this emerge in a national scene, maybe also a transnational geopolitical scene. For example, it could be a scene of war where there is war between some Western powers and other powers, or invasions. It could have to do with environment, climate. It could be cultural controversies, and also, of course, a variety of creed, religiosity, etc. So I think that is vital when we try to understand also the emergence of controversies when it comes to visuals such as cartoons. So then a definition of newspaper cartoons. Newspaper cartoons are defined as editorial comments. They can be very independent, or they can be linked to written comments and editorials, as we will see an example of later. They comment on daily news, but they can also be more timeless, as the cartoon you see to the right of the picture here. This is by one of my favorite cartoonists in Norway. She is Siri Dokken. She, after having been doing this work for many years for the Dagsavisen, a daily paper, she was promoted to the role of being also a part-time art professor at our University College of Art in Oslo. And you see the text here, why is your doll so fat? And this plays into the, you know, Barbie doll syndrome, where these dolls are so thin they can hardly stand up. So that is a more timeless cartoon, not linked to a particular issue which was in the news. They can be a variety of content too, as satire, caricatures of persons. They can be sketches of a situation and observations. I would say this one is a kind of observation or a philosophical kind of thing over youth culture and child culture. And also, of course, the cartoons, perhaps even more than text, since cartoons travel more easily into different areas. They can challenge the limits and also at times the laws regarding freedom of expression. I would say in most countries, since we had controversies at the national level here in Norway as well. So let me just point at one example from the past here. This is a bit old now, but we've had another one too that I couldn't find, which has also to do with Israel. This is a cartoon linked to a comment about, which is very critical to Israel. And Finn Graff is one of the most cherished cartoonists in Norway. What he does here is that he draws the then Israeli leader, Ehud Olmert, as a guard of a Nazi camp. And that is something that for Jews who might not support the state of Israel, still very provocative. So here you see a cartoon which may perhaps is more provocative than the text itself in this issue. And the reactions to it may be very guided by political outlook or by what kind of ethnic or religious background you have. Quite a lot of people with Jewish background would react to this one, and they did. There were lots of complaints to this particular cartoon. We have in Norway a press complaints commission, which is kind of a self-regulatory body appointed by the press organizations themselves. So this cartoon was complained to that press regulatory body, but the complaints in the end were dismissed after discussion in the commission. So this means, I mean, in our case and in this case, that they set a rather wide frame for what should be freedom of expression in Norway. If you allow a cartoon like this, you may also allow many other cartoons which are insulting to many people. This was an insult to many people who supported Israel, if they were not Jews, but also to many Jews in Norway. And that also leads me to one of the arguments which has come about quite frequently when it comes to cartoon issue, which is we should have the right to insult. People have to deal with being insulted. This is part of the freedom of expression. And this, I think, is a very controversial issue to this day around the world. So to the caricature crisis and diaspora, the Danish newspaper, actually the largest Danish newspaper, Jyllands-Posten, they published 12 cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad in a newspaper in Denmark. I will not show the cartoons, and this is out of sensitivity for my public on this occasion. If you think that's wrong, we can discuss that. But instead I show here a cartoon from the news, a cartoon actually of us, the Vikings. You see, I mean, this is how we're supposed to look in the good old days. In the past, we used to invade civilizations, but now we do that by cartoons. So yeah. Anyway, these publications originally were meant to show that people hesitated drawing the Prophet Muhammad. So it was originally an author who had authored a book on the Prophet Muhammad, and he wanted illustrators, and he contacted many people, and many said no out of fear. And then the newspaper got a hint of this story, and then commissioned 12 people who were willing to draw cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, out of which some, I think, 2 Muslims were quite provocative. Others actually provoked the whole issue. There was one cartoon in particular, which is a small boy named Muhammad, who draws on the blackboard of his classroom that the cartoonist of Jyllands-Posten, or the Jyllands-Posten, is a bunch of reactionary people or something like that. So, I mean, the 12 cartoons varied in content, very much so. Anyway, how could this become a global controversy? Partly, I think, because of bad diplomacy in the first part, in the sense that the Danish Prime Minister refused to meet with ambassadors from countries with Muslim majority. And that might have also triggered some imams to travel with their cartoons, and also with some other cartoons, which had nothing to do with this issue, to the Middle East. And then in January 2006, we saw, I mean, the publication was in August 2005. There were demonstrations in Denmark. It was largely a Danish issue from the beginning. Then some people brought it to the Middle East, and there were attacks on Norwegian and Danish embassies in Syria and in Lebanon. And I think also the issue here was that on the 10th of January 2006, a small Norwegian newspaper, a Christian Norwegian weekly, had republished the cartoons and stated its reasons, its ideological reasons for doing so. So we can ask then, was the initial initiative a provocation, or was it, as they would say themselves, this is a test of the freedom of expression situation in Denmark, a test of the amount of self-censorship there is in Denmark? Was it the case that these imams wanted to inflame the Middle East, or did that happen for other reasons? What we know for sure is that the media consumption of the cartoons became transnational. I would say in a very special way, because I think most people who reacted against the cartoons did not have a chance to see them. In Pakistan, very few people had seen them. I know that for a fact. Some of my students in Punjab University asked me to show them, but I couldn't get access to them so easily. You know, internet didn't function as well then as today. And then you had accusations. Of course, this is very kind of painting with a broad brush. In the non-West, so-called non-West, they would say that the Europeans were non-sensitive and argue that Europe is no longer the same since more than 20 million Muslims live there. And in the so-called West, there were also people in diaspora saying that you should take us into consideration. Do not make a bad name for Pakistan by resorting to violence. This is one of the arguments I found in the Norwegian press as the demonstrations in, for example, Lahore, to a degree turned violent. And also, of course, in the West, they would say that these fanatics in the East, they don't understand freedom of expression, etc., etc. All these arguments were floating around to a large extent. So I try here to sum up the overall reactions in Pakistan and Norway, linked to the press coverage, of course. And here you may challenge me. There there's much more there. But I had, as I said, the assistance of a colleague who could interpret and translate the Pakistani Urdu newspapers. So we were dealing with mostly Dawn and the News, and also with Nawai Waqt and oh, what is the biggest one? Help me now. The biggest Urdu newspaper.
It's
Not Nawai Waqt.
Jang.
Sorry, Jang. Yeah. So in Pakistan, the cartoons were largely seen as a provocation, an attack on 1.4, 1.3, 1.5 billion Muslims. I think the numbers were varied. I remember particularly one editorial who used the expression that the Danish cartoonists and the people who supported them, they were an example of Jacobin secularism. And for those of you who are not familiar with this concept, Jacobin connects to the French Revolution, and where the Jacobin turned out to be the fraction of the revolutionaries who turned more violent, especially after 1793, and there was the reign of terror, and a lot of people had to be forced to the guillotine and lose their heads there. So Jacobin secularism means, of course, extreme secularism. So here we have our first connection to extremism again. Also, some commentators and other people would link the cartoons to imperialism, to Western military inventions and wars, and say this is yet another way of attack on us Muslims. Could be Afghanistan war, and of course this was 2 years after the invasion of Iraq, which is another contextual matter. A critique would also be that this is a proof of the insensitivity towards European diaspora, as mentioned, the more than 20 million Muslims. The press, particularly, if we distinguish, we see that the reactions might be a bit less harsh in the English language publications than others. The explanation to that, to my mind at least, is not hard to find. I guess that the English language publications cater more to the Pakistani elite, which might be slightly more or much more liberal-minded than others, due to education level and other issues. And the most liberal-minded one, I think it was either in the Herald or in Newsline. And actually, there was one writer who defended the publication of the cartoons because he said they raised an important debate. So there was actually at least one voice within the press coverage in Pakistan who defended the publication of cartoons. I don't know what happened to him or whether he was anonymous, or I can't remember, but at least there was a diversity of reactions. That is my point here. Of course, there were lots of demonstrations, and I mentioned in one of the previous lectures that I witnessed the mall the day after the big demonstration in Lahore, where some houses were burnt down. All in all, 5 people were killed there, and one of them on the very campus where I lived with my husband by then. This was a baker who had been convinced to join the demonstration by students. He was shot by the police. Much property was destroyed, both here and there. And you might see the demonstrations continued. And to my mind and my analysis is that it was not only about the cartoons, which very few of the demonstrators had seen, but it was the, let's say, the imaginary thought of the cartoons, but also other issues, such as the Pakistan expected President Bush to visit in March, which was a controversial issue in itself, and the sugar prices and other food prices were on the rise, which actually hurt the poor. So that is, I mean, there's much more to say about that, and I've written at length about this also, but this is the short version. Norway, well, I found myself in Pakistan, but of course I kept track of what happened in Norway as much as I could. At the outset, I said there was a kind of reluctant support for the Danish newspaper and its publication. There would be facsimiles of the cartoons there, but not sort of ideologically grounded defense of republication before this small Christian paper republished in January 2006. Politic-wise, this was during our, we had a Labour government by then, a coalition government, and the question of dialogue versus confrontation to for example, the people who, the Muslims who reacted very harshly on this. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, he is now the leader of the Labour Party in Norway. He was very opening up for dialogue, and he initiated a dialogue with Indonesia, which interestingly enough led to 3 conferences with journalists from many parts of the world. You can read more about that also in Ansari's piece. I personally participated in all 3 of these conferences, and so did Una. And it was very interesting to have this exchange among journalists from different so-called civilizations and see how we all read the cartoon issue at different levels. Debates emerged among Muslims in Norway, among journalists with Muslim background, but also among other journalists, and there were plenty of meetings of dialogue between them. And Ansari speaks at length about that in his chapter, which I recommend now for the 3rd time. And then you can say the interpretations in Norway were quite diversified. Some would even say that this was a provocation, the Jyllandsposten publishing. Some would say, well, we support freedom of expression and the right to publish these cartoons, but we think it's unwise due to the situation of tension between Muslims and non-Muslims. And some would then say, no, this is good because it's testing the level of free expression and we should welcome this. So there was a diversity of opinion also here. Okay. So how do we see each other? This is just 2 very different cartoons that I'd like to show you. The one is made by a right-wing commentator, Daniel Pipes, very right-wing actually, who actually accuses then Muslim reactions of being double standard. Because as he says, there are quite a few people in the Middle East who would make nasty cartoons of Jews. I don't know to what level that is true. I haven't found very much, but I think there are such cartoons. And then, of course, there is on the other hand, the I would say the simplification of the Danish issue, because this drawing looks very, sympathetic and all, disregarding, of course, then that in the interpretation of Islam, images such as this shouldn't be there at all. But I mean, this is not how the 12 cartoons looked. On the other hand, you have a man that I've met on several occasions, Maxim, who has done cartoons for The Nation, as you surely know, who then cartoons us again. I mean, I'm part of the West. I can't deny that. I was born and brought up here. And then looking at the West as a kind of warrior-like type. So here is the sort of equalization between war and the cartoon provocation, in a sense. So, but is this the way we see each other? And what kind of we's are we then talking about? We could at length bring up concepts such as Orientalism and Occidentalism, Orientalism being the simplification of the Orient done in a Western manner, and also the way in which they have a hierarchical view on the Orient as being less developed, less of everything. On the other hand, Occidentalism is the disregard for Western culture and maybe also caricaturing how we in the West are, because in both of these we's there is a vast diversity, and I think that is very important to underline. So coming to the aftermath of the crisis, many people were killed in the protests. The ones I know about: in Afghanistan 5, Pakistan 5, Libya 11, and Nigeria in large demonstrations. This is a large country too, 140 about. Smaller incidents would follow with other cartoonists. I will come back to the example from Norway 2008, when a mid-Norway newspaper published another cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad. In Sweden, there have been several cases, and some of the cases have been rather, I'd say, innocent. Some cases were more racist, extremist, and having nothing to do with Islam or Muslims, but rather cartooning. For example, there was a Norwegian couple, one of our previous ministers married, a minister for the Labour Party married a lady with a Gambian Norwegian background, who then, of course, had a browner outlook than the majority Norwegian one. And they were cartooned with, they were expecting a child, and they were cartooned with a baby looking like a monkey, which is, in my opinion, very racist. So, I mean, some very extreme cartoons came about, and it seemed to become a game of how much can we dare to do, you know, and then challenging again the limits of freedom of expression. Then, of course, when we come to almost 10 years after the initial cartoons in the Danish paper, we had the attack on January 7th in 2015 on the satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo, which had published several cartoons on the Prophet Muhammad. And 12 people were killed on it all, mostly staff from Charlie Hebdo, including, by the way, one guard who stood outside and who was actually a Muslim. Two at a Jewish shopping center. So there was a variety of victims, but mostly the staff, cartoonists themselves at this paper. And that created a large reaction across the world. There was actually a demonstration with state leaders in Paris, where state leaders from countries which are not really famous for freedom of expression, including, I think, a representative of Saudi Arabia joined. So what have we learned from this? Was this a learning process? Can we see any positive experiences from all these clashes, these controversies? This is actually what we, as the collective that studied the cartoon controversy, drew up, trying to position the various discourses, the various positions that came in the press coverage in a variety of countries after the publication of the Muhammad cartoons. You see here, this is kind of a, for those of you who know Bourdieu, you would know that he's very familiar with these two axes. You see here on top, the point of view, the discourse that freedom of speech is a universal and absolute value. It should not be contextual to wherever you live. It should be absolute. This is something we all should fight for, wherever we are. And at the bottom of the same axis, you see that another position, which is freedom of speech as a relativized cultural value, which means that it depends on the circumstances. In countries where there is this and that religious or situation or other situation, and with other laws, more regard for blasphemy issues and so on, one has other priorities. Then you have the horizontal axis, which deals with dialogue. Should we engage across cultures and identities, or mainly keep the dialogues within the separate cultures and identities? And as you see, we have distinguished four, I wouldn't call them extremes, but maybe they are to a certain extent. I would say perhaps the ones to the left, both up and down, could be bordering on extremism. Excuse me, I have to sneeze. No, not. On top here, you see the liberal fundamentalism, as we called it, which means that this is an absolute value. There is no borders. There is no limits to it. We should accept any kinds of expressions. This is what we label that. And on the other side of this axis to the left, you see the ethnic religious fundamentalism, which means that we think that freedom of expression should be curbed. There should be limits. There are certain issues we don't touch. And those who practice the freedom of expression mentioned above should be severely punished. On the right-hand side, you have the more in-betweener position, we could say. The liberal pragmatism would be positions such as the one I mentioned, like, for example, well, I support freedom of expression, but I would not print cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad out of sensitivity to my Muslim friends, the Muslim diaspora, Muslim world, etc. And at the bottom there, you'll see also the sense of dialogic multiculturalism, that yes, we have to respect the different cultures, that they practice freedom of expression in a different manner from us, but we can still engage a dialogue with them over this issue to try to understand each other more. I think this is how I'd define these positions that we identified around 13 years ago in our research. So this is the beginning of a summing up of this lecture, actually. Further discussion and research should be going on. Here you see, for example, one of the discussions that we need to address, namely the discussions of double standards. This is illustrated here by a cartoon I found among many others at the Al Jazeera homepage. I don't think it needs much explanation. But one of the, at least recognitions that we should all embrace, I think, is that we live in one world. And there is an increasing need to communicate across the continents. And the corona issue has certainly also reminded us about this one world. Of course, the one world could be equal to a passenger ship where there are different classes, where you have the top people, maybe some of you have seen the Titanic, where you had the top people who were rescued to a much larger extent than the people traveling on third class. So yes, recognizing one world, albeit a lot of social and other differences, but still a need to communicate across continents, as we try to do today. We live in a diasporic world, which means that, as Stuart Hall once said, we cannot say that the East is the East and the West is the West. The West is now everywhere, and so is the East. Meaning that people move, people settle, and they bring their luggage, be it cultural, be it religious and other, with them. Third, I think we should address the issue of conspiracy theories, both in the so-called West and in the so-called East. They exist in all countries, I believe, and they have been encouraged and I think also increased to a large extent by social media growth. Fourth, I think even if we might disagree very much when it comes to cartoons and freedom of expression, I think we could have some shared ethics, and that is the critique of both conspiracy theories and the double standards. I remember much from the Pakistani newspapers about how, oh, you in the West, you speak about freedoms and human rights, but how did you treat people in Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq? How do you treat, I mean, you have your own death penalty and you have your own discrimination issues. So, I mean, this kind of backfiring to the Western promotion or trying to promote itself as totally liberal and humanistic would be there much in the Pakistani press and in press elsewhere, no doubt. Then again, I remember one issue particularly raised in one of the conferences initiated by the Indonesian and Norwegian governments. I think it was a Spanish journalist who raised the issue. Are we now in this world to tolerate intolerance, meaning that should we tolerate that people now burn effigies of cartoonists, of journalists, and so on? And then again, where is tolerance, where is intolerance? It's not an easy subject. Of course, some people would raise the debate of freedom of expression at the cost of consideration for the other. I remember a Pakistani journalist who would say that, well, this cartoon issue, it hurts our rights for free expression because they are curbed and maybe tightened due to this crisis. Could be. I would not deny that. And then again, who would be the victims of stricter freedom of expression regulations if we go for that? Who are the victims of strict blasphemy laws, etc.? All this are questions to be raised and to do further research upon, I believe. So to end this with a story, cartoons travel, but discourses and contexts do not travel to the same extent. That is one thing we learned, I think, from the cartoon issue. I mean, the images might travel both in the sense that people could look at the images and also in the more imaginary sense of being told about cartoons. But this opens up for different reactions in the global variety of what is called societies of interpretation. And a story now to end it all and open for the debate. In 2008, a Norwegian TV reporter, whose image you see here with the Afghan shawl around his neck, as I recognize, and some of you might recognize too, He traveled into the federally administered tribal areas 12 years ago. The reason he did this was that the same year, one colleague of both Una and myself, Karsten Thomassen, had been killed by Taliban extremists at a hotel in Kabul. He was killed, and a Norwegian diplomat was severely wounded. And of course, this was a shock because that was the first Norwegian victim in recent times to that kind of extremist. So this reporter wanted to find out who groomed these suicide people, these suicide attackers, who were behind this. And he traveled then to what was reputed to be an extremist madrasa in South Waziristan, and tried to find out more. He interviewed these people. He also went to prison to interview the actual survivor of the attack at this Serena hotel in Kabul. So he went to this madrasa. He was very cordially welcomed. I, for one, know much about Pashtun hospitality, and so do many of you. So he was welcomed, and you're our guest, please sit down, chat with us, and you can stay overnight. And he said yes, he accepted the invitation. And then during the evening, of course, one of them would jokingly say that, Mr. Reporter, you know, we actually could kill you because you belong to a nation that wages war against our Muslim brethren in Afghanistan. And then they were all joking, and it seemed just like a joke, so he didn't take it seriously. And it seems the mullah, who was the head of the students there, he didn't either. So they went to sleep, and the students would quarrel to sleep next to the reporter because they wanted to talk more to him. Some of them knew some English, so that's how it went. The next morning, however, sentiments had changed, and they had changed for the worse. Some students would then come up to Frederick, our colleague, and start almost punching him physically. And why was that? Well, the reason for that was that during the night, one of them had on his then, rather primitive cell phone compared to the cell phones we have nowadays, or at least most of us, and had received an MMS, a picture, an image of a cartoon that had been published in a mid-Norwegian newspaper of the Prophet Muhammad, a rather, I would say, to standards, provocative one. And then they said, well, you belong to this tradition or something like that. And they started punching him. Then the mullah intervened and said, no, you cannot do that. He is our guest and he should be free to travel back to Peshawar, which was where he came from. So after being quite a bit scared, the reporter went back to Peshawar and wrote his blog. And his blog was titled, "Do Norwegian Editors Tried to Get Me Killed?" Do the Norwegian editors try to have me killed? This was his second time encountering such anger due to cartoons. He had also experienced this previously on a reportage trip to Gaza, Palestine. The blog had more responses than he'd ever had of any of his other blog entries during his then experience. And you would find there the variety of discourses, some saying that by his reaction, he would actually be against freedom of expression, which was very bad in their eyes. Some others would say that we should show more sensitivity, and we are hurting people who try to report the news and so on. And there were some in-betweeners who said that, well, there's freedom of expression, but there's also sensitivity. So I made an article on this blog discussion and the whole story, which is also published. You can ask for the link, I can send it to you. Because to me that opened again the eyes of mine to how fast cartoons, images may travel, even to areas where they have totally different contexts. I mean, Fata, with its low literacy level, with its remoteness from, let's say, rule, being much self-rule over there still, I guess. And then again, mid-Norway with its, peaceful liberality, two very different communities who might never be able to meet. So to just wrap up, how can we, with these very different interpretations and these very different encounters, try to coexist on this planet? And I end up with an image which is also published in the book that is kind of a readings for this course. And this is a photo I took when I was stationed in Paris in the spring of 2015, outside the Centre des Études Arabes, which means the Center for Arabic Studies. And what you see here are how they have put the symbols of the three religions to the left, then Islam, in the middle Judaism, and to the right Christianity, into the word coexist, which I think is a rather beautiful expression, particularly from such an institute during such a historical context. So that is my lecture, and then we can move, I guess, to discussion.
Zoom recording, here we are. So let's hope that I am able to find, where is that? So, that's, we have to take this one out. I think this is the desktop. Is this my desktop? Oh no.
This is mine.
Okay, let me find it. So where am I? Oh, what am I sharing? I'm sharing my full desktop?
Yeah, you do. You have
Okay.
a rather interesting desktop.
Right. There's everything on it, in fact. So how should I read that? So it's again the same problem. So advanced, something like that. No. So I'm going for my left desktop and I'm not finding what I'm going to.
If you had sent it to me, I could have found it for you, like you did with me last time.
So here we are. I think I've done it. So
yeah, there you are.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. Now what I have to do is, now first and foremost, you should know that I'm not the guy who was supposed to speak today. So don't expect much. So everybody can see that. So the topic that first we had, I just thought about it, and that we could connect on the same issue. And I read a bit yesterday, and I also had experienced that when in 2005. I remember Professor Shahjahan is also here. I was in my office in, I think it was 2005 somehow. And it was in Professor Shahjahan's office, and he left me with two Western women. And he said that Altaf will speak about it. And I didn't know. I didn't know about the cartoon controversy. I didn't know about anything. And these were two Danish journalists. And they asked me the question that, what are your views on the cartoon controversy? Oblivious as I always am, I didn't know about it. Honestly, I didn't have any idea what was going on, because I was not viewing media and stuff like that. Television was PTV, and I was not into cable television. And I said, I don't know about it. And they said, people died. And my response at that time was that if somebody says something about my religion in their own homes, it's not my problem. But if somebody says it in my face, then it becomes my problem. These are my, I was not young, but still kind of 15 years back. But it really affected Pakistan, and it really affected the relationship between media and government, and also different religious groups in Pakistan. And they became more and more sensitive towards it, and freedom of expression became very difficult. And we discussed in the last lecture the death of Mashal Khan. And we remember that he wrote a verse from Abdul Hamid Adam on his Facebook page, and this was also considered to be blasphemous. And he was, amongst many other reasons, this was also a reason. So a lot has changed. But I'm just concentrating on freedom and control in Pakistan. So the historical role of media in Pakistan. My focus will be about just to simply define what media is in Pakistan and the way journalists see their roles and what the government or people who are in power see their goals and how does it add to conflict and what are the outcomes of this conflict. So when we look at the historical role of media in the undivided India or in the subcontinent before partition, the Muslim press, if we take it for that, although the all Indian press was like that, was an adversary press. So they were speaking truth to power, like to the colonial masters. And this was considered to be the role of journalism, to stand up against the British colonialists and confiscation of securities or the printing presses, like Maulana Zafar Ali Khan's printing press was confiscated. It used to get confiscated every next day, and it used to cost 2,000, and then people used to collect money and buy him another one, and he used to do the same again. So that was a very different role. It was an anti-colonial press, but especially the Muslim press, like the Muslim-owned press, basically, and which was run by Muslims, was mostly solo journalism. Like the big names like Maulana Muhammad Ali Johar and Abul Kalam Azad, Zafar Ali Khan, or before that, Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan. All these people were people who are elites in society, religious elites, political elites, social elites, and they used media as an instrument to further their views. And these newspapers were read more because of their owners or the journalists that worked in them, that were behind those newspapers, than for their news value. So we have a taste of opinion which goes back into history. And then the government at that time, we have to understand how the Raj government worked. It was based on censorship. The British government was prone to censorship, and it had a very strong censorship in Britain also, like not only in the colonies, but also in not the empire and the colonies, but also in Britain also. There was this office of censorship where there was a censor officer, and there are a lot of stories that the censor officer was called back from his vacations just to censor a newspaper, just to read it all and censor it. So the British had this tendency. If we go into the blasphemy issues, British again have this tendency of declaring certain issues unpublishable. So, but we are not discussing that. And then the British also believed in strict control of whatever goes on. This is evident from the beginning of laws about the media, like the Wellesley Regulations of 1799. These were about how to publish a newspaper, when to publish a newspaper, no newspaper on the weekend, and things like that. I won't be answering that one. And so the British government was in a way in what we call, they like to steer the discourse. Like they wanted to control the discourse. How did they try to do that? Like in the early, the late 19th centuries, and also the early 20th, the early 19th century. I just missed a few centuries. All right, sorry, my apologies, but somehow I have to write on this one. Okay. So what they did, that when the Second Charter Act was passed in 1813, they gave money to the Dutch missionaries of Srirampur to start newspapers. And so that's how they used to support media. They used to support media by giving them money and whatever, and buying all the newspapers that they published. So in this way, they were in a habit of supporting a government-supported press. The British also played with the idea of a government-owned newspaper, but they never decided to control and have a government newspaper, like a government-owned newspaper. They supported the first Urdu newspaper in 1822 or 23, which was Jame Jahanuma. It had company seal on it. It just managed to work for 1 or 2 years, but then they decided not to go on with the idea. So they never considered the idea of government-owned newspapers to be feasible. And then we come to independence, and we see we from the very beginning we got a government which was somehow trying to get into the shoes of the earlier colonial masters. And many people have written about this, that they wanted more control of the discourse, and in that way they were not very favorable towards the media. And the media naturally wished to play its adversarial role because they had political stalwarts who had with opinions, and they had everybody. Wait a moment, sorry, I have to somehow hang. My apologies. I'm home. So sorry. So the media always, and this is known from the Press Commission's report in. Oh God, sorry guys. I'm sorry. I'll just hang it down. So we don't expect guests. My apologies again. So this is evident from the Press Commission's report in 1958, and I still don't understand why the Press Commission was ordered to get into an investigation of whether the Pakistani press is loyal or not. But the report said that the press by and large is loyal, and it has all the weaknesses that are part and parcel of a newly born institution, but still the loyalty is unquestioned. But with those two different roles, the government trying to fill in the shoes of the colonial Raj administration, and a media that wanted to go on with the motto of a good government with an adversary press becomes a great government, a clash was imminent. And this happened very early. Like in the 1950s, we see news about bribing certain newspapers. There were newspapers who were on government's pay list. Government used to pay them in the early 50s. And unfortunately, one of the newspapers, after Maulana Zafar Ali Khan died, after his death was Zamindar also. Zamindar was also one of the recipients of government money. And then we see Ayub Khan's martial law, which was really the beginning of the end of media freedoms. What did they do? Like the difference between many other regimes and General Ayub Khan is that General Ayub Khan started with a systematic control of discourse. Like the first and foremost action was the formation of the National Press Trust. What is the National Press? The National Press Trust meant that it had nationalized all local newspapers. At that time, it took over Pakistan Times, Imroz, and Lailo Nihar. And this was Progressive Papers Limited. The charge against that newspaper, and you know, look at the names of the editors, like Mazhar Ali Khan was editor-in-chief, Faiz Ahmed Faiz was editor of Pakistan Times, Chirag Hassan Hasrat was editor of Imroz, and Ahmad Nadeem Qasmi was editor of Lailo Nihar, the weekly. So this was really a very powerful newspaper, even if you look at the, and it had to be vocal also. It's really interesting that it was nationalized and the allegation was against the owner was Mia Iftikharuddin, was that he had 26 lakh rupees in a bank in England, which the government suspected him to get from Russia. When General Ayub Khan started payback, he sent a 26 lakh, like 2.6 million rupees check to Mia Iftikharuddin. Mia Iftikharuddin returned it by saying that he didn't pay any donation in the independence movement, so the government should accept it as that. He didn't take the money back. So the question, so from the very beginning, we see that the military rule at that time was not in a mood to let the narrative fall into wrong hands. Then they went on with Press and Publication Ordinance 1960 and 1963 with the largest number of do's and don'ts, just inclusive, including everything. So there was a lot of, and there were kind of, those who know history is that Ayub Khan's era was really very difficult for journalists. Although journalists never knew that there are more difficult times to come. Then there was also, since we are discussing the whole idea of freedom of expression, the Writers Guild were formed. Like there were different intellectuals. So I think, is there a problem? No. So the Writers Guild were formed, and Ahmad Nadeem Qasmi unfortunately became part of the Writers Guild. So he was the one who joined it, as that's where the divide began within the intelligentsia, and there was an enforced conformity at work also. Like the New Leaf was the title of the editorial, which all the Pakistani newspapers were asked to publish, including the Progressive Papers Limited. And the New Leaf was an article which was about Pakistan Times and Imroz. And it was written by the government. I think Qudatullah Shahab or Altaf Hussain, somebody might have written it. And it was about how, like, it was kind of a announcement of being on the right path now by the Progressive Paper Limited newspapers. Faiz Ahmed Faiz published it in the Pakistan Times, whereas Chirag Hasan Hasrat refused to publish it, and he told Faiz that this will go a long way in his life, publishing this one, and Faiz always regretted it. And then we see the birth of television within strict government controls. I'll discuss it a bit later. So when we look at media in terms of control in Pakistan, the way government deals with them, not now, I'm just talking about a historical background. Press, newspaper was suspect but free. Like newspapers were free. They were private newspapers a lot. Radio, as His Majesty's policy, was too important to be left on its own. It was government owned before that, and it remained government owned and after independence. It was not until General Musharraf's era when television and radio, private television and radio was allowed. Private television still has more freedom to speak, although the conflict is also intense. But private radio doesn't have that much of freedom. And so this is the birth of television. I just took the liberty of, this is Dawn revisited it after 50 years, I think. And they published an article which was about, there are two things. These are the first pictures, which is, and it was considered to be a government pilot TV project in 1964, I think. And interesting is the text of General Ayub Khan's speech. I can't read the whole text right now, but the crux of the matter was that the then President and Field Marshal Ayub Khan said that although there are other pressing issues to attend to, but he needs a direct connection with the people. And television is an innovation that is very useful. And he said that he was cautioned by others, telling him that this is a dangerous medium and it might fall into the wrong hand. And he said, we have taken care of it. Television will not have any financial autonomy, so the government will control all the finances. PTV and policies will also be designed by the government. So he assured the public that their new medium is in safe hands, and these safe hands were supposed to be of the military ruler. And so there is a very interesting book by Rai Shakil, The Religion, Media and Politics in Pakistan. It's worth reading if you have the time. Like, what are the main ways of controlling media while keeping democratic appearances also? State security, for example, national integrity, religious sentiment. These are the three things that played a big role in controlling media. Not that we didn't have those problems, but at times that I mentioned earlier also, governments in Pakistan tend to exaggerate these problems, and its biggest victim is either opposition. Opposition is not a victim right now. It was earlier. It's the transformation of the global information system has given a lot of security to individual politicians and political parties, but media still is kind of in a fix. So what is the demand basically when you cite these measures? So the demand here is basically that you have to, sorry, I think I have, okay. That loyalty to the state. So newspapers and media professionals are well aware when they are termed to be responsible, to be disloyal to the state, and so it's not directly said that they are disloyal to a certain institution or individual, but the larger matrix of statehood is brought into the discourse, which is very helpful when you try to control a huge group of people who are not very well literate. And the idea of nationhood is also directly connected. That, do you remember last year when there was this dogfight between Pakistan and India's air forces and stuff like that? So immediately we have seen that there are voices of controlling the media right now and having a narrative that is useful in these times of crisis. And if you see countries like Pakistan always remain in times of crisis, blasphemy is an issue in its own very self, you know. So there are, since Pakistan is an Islamic republic, and wherever there is religion is important in any constitution or any society and state, blasphemy becomes one part of it. As I said in earlier comment also, that Pakistan, one way of the argument in favor of blasphemy laws, if you have a religious structure in place, is that you have to ensure the sanctity of your own religion. But then another part of it is that you also have to ensure sanctity of all other religions or any identities that live within the limits of the state. I think personally that Pakistan is good at the first one, but it fails miserably when it comes to defend the faith of minorities. Like, the government doesn't have much to offer. Although there are specific laws about that also, but these are not followed as vehemently as we go for the majority. Like, now we come to a bit of a theoretical area, and we talk about the role of government. like governments are there basically to regulate it. A democratic government is there to regulate. It's not there, like it's not the Leviathan of Thomas Hobbes. It doesn't have any divine right to exist. Like it has certain functions to perform. One of those is regulatory. Like there are laws and the government ensures that these laws are followed. And if these are changed, these go through a process, which brings it again to the next role, which is sustaining balance and equilibrium in a society, that chaos doesn't exist. And then keeping order is, these are all in the same, these are all together. And this brings us to a role where in a democratic society, we have the idea, and I am borrowing the idea of Jacques Derrida, and who says that there is a negative morality and there is a positive morality. Government wants to restore and ensure order. So government will also always pose some inhibitions. They'll say this is something that you can't do. And that's governance. So that's the negative morality, because it doesn't allow change. The positive morality, on the other hand, is freedom of expression, transparency. So, and most of intelligentsia in a society plays that role, different viewpoints that challenge different established institutions. The government role is in a democracy is that they make that change in a way that it doesn't result in a chaos. Like they don't stall change, but they just make sure that the changes are not somehow chaotic and everything, that it doesn't fall into anarchy. Most of the time, in most of the states, democratic states, media has a central role in elaborating positive morality. Like it gives opinion, it gives information, it gives space to certain opinions which challenge the existing status quo. And all these things are considered to be part and parcel of a democratic dispensation. So the point here is that how do the journalists see themselves in Pakistan? Well, if these are the two roles that we have to see whether the governments and the journalists fit into that roles. So what are the journalists' professional self-conceptions? How do they see themselves? My study was back in 2003. So it was about professional self-conception of journalists. I have not revisited it, so I'm just basically basing my words on information that is quite early. Like much have changed, but this is the only study I have. Like most of the Pakistani journalists consider themselves to be educators, and they think that it is their role to educate people who are troubled by lack of education, lack of resources, lack of livelihood. It's their role that they educate these people. So somehow you see many names in Pakistani journalism who are known for their educational role, and still we respect a lot journalists who are educators in a sense. Leaders also. Some of the journalists do have that leading role, going back to Abul Kalam Azad and Muhammad Ali Jawhar and people like that. So we do keep that role. The role of informant, which is one of the basic roles in a democracy, is considered to be a least right role. And I must say that I'm saying it on the basis of information which is quite old. Role might have changed. The way I see it, they haven't, but still. Governments, on the other hand, are also not very democratic in their tendencies. Like in Pakistan, politics is played on the basis of charisma, personal and political, like our present Prime Minister, Imran Khan. Most of his following is based on charisma. Like people say, he has charisma, which is personal charisma. And people love him for that, and they condone a lot of stuff that he might not be allowed to do. Like you can't just get away with that number of marriages that easily. I'm sorry if I hurt anybody's feelings, but normally in a Muslim society, it's not easy, especially in Pakistan. And also they have the role that the custodian role, that they think that they are there to save, to secure what is there. Like the recent controversy, Maulana Tariq Jamil and journalists was about that Maulana Tariq Jamil was praising the present ruler as the only hope for Pakistan. It's true for everybody. Like this is Hobbes' Leviathan. Like you have to submit all your freedoms to the Leviathan, and that Leviathan will ensure your safety, your security, your sustenance. This is a wrong role to have in a democracy, but still Pakistani rulers tend to think like that. And also, by virtue of that, they would also like to control the discourse. And you see it so very often that ministers and heads of the state talk about their Pakistan. Like they say this is their vision for the country. So this is more about a populist narrative than anything realistic. You don't see much on the ground, but you see a lot of talk and people accepting that. And then they also try to kind of demarcate the level of freedom and how the discourse will go. Like presently, like the symbolic aspects are like Imran Khan doesn't care about clothes and he's happy in 300 rupees shalwar kameez, and look at other people who are wearing suits. Like wearing suits might become a crime. And I have seen that during General Ziaul Haq's era, everybody was wearing shalwar kameez and sherwanis and stuff like that. So there is a lot of symbolic stuff going on in a charismatic environment. Okay. I hope that I don't. So where are we right now, basically? The new regime, and when I say regime, it's not simply the government, the media also. It is well known that social media adds to our narcissism. There are studies on that, that social media is basically a narcissistic medium. And if you are not narcissistic, like I might count myself in, you won't be very successful on social media. So you have to really show your feelings and you have to really talk about stuff. And somehow this is also influencing or helping the existing role conceptions of Pakistani journalists. So they are on YouTube and they are just making speeches everywhere and they are jumping into controversies, journalists every now and then. And the same is true for government. We always had a populist government. Like, so when an American friend asked me, how do you feel about Donald Trump when Donald Trump came to power? And I said, we are fine with him because we live in a populist country. Like all the governments were populist in Pakistan. So they are about tall talks and like they never walk the talk. They normally talk the talk. And then it brings us, the result of such engagements is that fake news has become somehow an order of the day, but so is whataboutism. I haven't written it over here. Whataboutism is that when you talk and you see it on the social media discourse, you see it on the mainstream media discourse, that whenever you ask a question, somebody will just throw another question in your face. What about that guy? And this creates an alternative truth. This is my opinion. Like in coronavirus, you see a lot of that new remedies coming in, and everybody will say this is true. And I saw press conference from some journalists, and then professors were sharing it that they had cure for coronavirus. And they said that the Pakistani government gave them a shut-up call, and so they are going public with YouTube channels or whatever. But things like that. So you get into an environment where freedom is basically no more exercisable. It's not easy to exercise freedom in such a chaotic environment where everybody, like every voice is considered to be worth fighting for or dying for, and everybody's opinion is sacred. It becomes really difficult to have freedom of expression if on both sides of the divide You have a government which is all about themselves, individuals who care about themselves and who think that they are the custodians of all good in a society, and a media which is also populist, following the lead from social media with a background that is more of educators and guides than informants. And where are we now? I just saw Hamid Meer's interview the other day, and it was really interesting what he said. Sabuk Sayyid asked him that he runs a YouTube channel. And Sabuk asked him that previously he said that only 10% of Pakistani journalists speak truth. It was in the context of Tariq Jameel Saab's statement. And he said, no, and that's the spin. And he said, no, I said that only 10% truth could be spoken. Right now, we can't even speak 5%, which is true also. We are here with the clash of egos and the clash of interests and all these things happening. We see that government is resorting to extreme control of the narrative by bringing in new laws. They are thinking about what they call, I think there is a new law which they are thinking about it, but they didn't bring it in. And it will just be one law for all different media, including social media. And you see that social media is being also targeted by PTA and many other. I'm not talking about right and wrong of it, you know, but I'm talking about the way government is approaching this issue of freedom of expression and freedom of journalism. And journalist defiance is on the way out. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the way resources are dying, the way people are getting more of their information from social media, and there is this mistrust against media because populist leadership has more influence over the narrative, and it's happening all over the world. In the US also, where Donald Trump is really controlling the narrative somehow, and the media in that country, which had a very strong media, is really at a loss, fighting that one single person and his ideas. But the problem here is that it is not about. With all due respect, I'll just go back to Fawad Chaudhry's statement when he was Minister of Information, when he said that why do media teaching institutions offer media education, because the media is going to die anywhere, so you won't be finding a job. I won't speak about the economics of media and the politics of media, but I must say that if you want to have a democracy, you need media for that. Like, it's the fourth pillar of a state. There are many ideas. People say that, no, that's not true. But somehow, if you decide to have a parliament, if you decide to have a judiciary, if you decide to have what we call an executive, you need a media also, a freely working media that could be that could help you in governing people, because you don't have a divine right to govern people. You have an indirect right by vote, and media somehow helps you in keeping your path straight. There might be disagreements. You might not like individual journalists. You might not like individual institutions, but you have to ensure that media as an institution survives and thrives. And this point is the role of government is not in line with the role of democratic governance. The point that I have made, that you have to ensure that media is free. You have to play your role of regulator. You have to play your role of basically of an executive or parliamentary or a judicial decision maker. But you have to make sure that the institution works. What to do right now? We have to adapt a lot, because the social media onslaught on mainstream media is not going to end soon. It's going to heighten, and we have to really, because I think that to ensure freedom of expression, you have to do good journalism. And there is no wrong journalism, basically. The good journalism is that it should adapt with the passage of time. Since most of the information are coming from citizen journalism, and so our roles are changing, basically. So we have to adapt, we have to analyze, and we have to learn to analyze in a way that's everyday experience. Like, we have to really get into organized analysis, which is not our strength. We are very opinion-based. And then we have to organize our structures, basically. We have to think about ethics. We have to think about to demarcating our own boundaries, because unless you have a good ethical system, code of ethics at work, governments will come after you. They will come after with new rules. But if you have an ethical system and you are responsible and these are there, I know that individual institutions do have codes of ethics, but Pakistani media doesn't have a uniform code of ethics. And you have to innovate a lot, like how to present your story, what aspects to cover, how to tell stories, and all these things. And in this process, we have to learn. Many of the journalists, I think, unfortunately, think that they don't need to learn. It's a lifelong learning process, and you have to be open to learning new skills and unlearning the ones that are not useful, like organizing cockfights on TV shows is not the right way to work. We have to unlearn that. And you also have to adjust. No matter how lofty your ideals are, like politics also, journalism is also the game of the possible. So we have to somehow learn to live in an environment which is not perfect, but in which our role is very important. So that's the end of it. Thank you very much. And my apologies again. I was filling in for somebody else who was very knowledgeable. So if there are any questions, I would love to answer them. And now I have to see stuff. Sorry.